Chapter 1. The Singing Widow. It was on one of those damp and listless London mornings in early March when the peculiar case first announced itself, not with a bang, but a whisper. Holmes had just returned from an early walk through Regent's Park, his coat still glistening with droplets and his keen eyes alert despite the overcast sky. I had been engrossed in reading a particularly dense monograph on cranial injuries in cavalry regiments, and had only half noticed Holmes's silent entry until he gave one of those dry little coughs that usually preceded either a deduction or a request for breakfast. "I take it, Watson," he said, removing his gloves with methodical precision, "that you've heard nothing of note from Scotland Yard this week? Nothing, unless one considers a jewel theft in Paddington worth remarking upon," I replied, folding the journal. "A well-dressed pickpocket and a pawned ruby brooch." Holmes offered the barest flicker of interest. "Too straightforward. We'll leave that to Lestrade. No, I refer instead to a singular occurrence in Hampstead. A widow recently bereaved who sings at her husband's grave each morning." I frowned. Morbid, but hardly criminal. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "So the Yard believes, but I think differently." He moved to his desk and retrieved a letter. The envelope creased from travel, the ink slightly blurred by rain. "This arrived while I was out. It is from a Mr. Percival Fenwick, a solicitor who manages the affairs of the late Mr. Albert Hargreave, whose widow, Eleanor, is the subject of some considerable local curiosity." I took the letter and began to read. It was brief, formal, and clearly written in a hand that bore the hallmarks of a man not prone to dramatics. "Mr. Holmes, I hope you will forgive the boldness of this request. I write on behalf of the estate of the late Albert Hargreave, who passed away under seemingly natural circumstances 4 weeks ago. His widow, Mrs. Eleanor Hargreave, has since taken to an unusual ritual. Each morning, just before dawn, she visits his grave in St. Jude's Cemetery and sings in a language no one has been able to identify. The locals speak of hauntings. I do not believe in such things, but I do believe something is amiss. She has dismissed her staff, refuses all visitors, and has become, for lack of a better word, transformed. I fear there is more to this than grief. If you are willing to come to Hampstead, I shall provide whatever assistance I can. You will be doing a service to a good man's memory, and perhaps saving his widow from whatever affliction has taken root." Holmes watched me as I finished, reading. "Well?" I hesitated. "It's strange, certainly, but what do you suspect? Grief manifests in many ways." Holmes moved to the fireplace and lit a match with a flourish. "True, but grief does not typically sing in dead languages, nor does it inspire local constables to mark the hour of dawn with loaded pistols." I raised an eyebrow. "Pistols?" He nodded. "Fenwick's letter omits it, but I made inquiries on my walk. The constable on duty near St. Jude's claims to have heard something unearthly 2 mornings prior. He now refuses to patrol near the cemetery until daylight." "Well," I said, rising, "I must admit it is more interesting than jewel theft." We arrived in Hampstead by cab that afternoon, the journey marked by low-hanging clouds and occasional gusts of wind that tossed chimney smoke sideways. The village had an unsettling stillness, its lanes too empty for the hour. When we arrived at the offices of Percival Fenwick, I was struck immediately by the solicitor's appearance. Neat to the point of austerity, with the air of a man desperately trying to appear unbothered. "I'm grateful you came," Fenwick said as he led us to a private study panelled in dark walnut. "This matter has made the servants nervous. 3 have quit. The gardener refuses to go near the mausoleum. I'm at a loss." "Tell us about the husband," Holmes said without preamble. "Albert Hargreave. His death was expected." Fenwick paused, then retrieved a thin file from a nearby cabinet. "Not unexpected. He had a weak heart. He died in his study. No signs of struggle. The death certificate reads cardiac arrest, signed by Dr. Miles Penrose, a friend of the family. But it was abrupt." "And the widow? She was inconsolable at first," Fenwick said. "Understandable, but something changed. 2 days after the funeral, she dismissed the staff, refused my visits. Then the reports began. Her standing at the grave in the morning fog, singing in a voice no one recognized." Holmes leaned forward. "And the language? Has anyone made a phonetic transcription?" Fenwick produced a notebook. "From the constable. He jotted down what he could hear." Holmes scanned it, eyes narrowing. "Curious. These phonemes resemble Old Church Slavonic. Possibly a corrupted dialect, not common knowledge." "And what of the grave?" I asked. "Is it undisturbed?" "So far," Fenwick said. "But if you visit, you'll see it yourself. She'll be there tomorrow at dawn, without fail." That evening Holmes and I took rooms at the inn overlooking St. Jude's Cemetery. From our window we could see the wrought iron gates and the shadowed path that led among the tombstones. At dusk a figure emerged, tall, slender, wrapped in a dark shawl, and knelt at a grave beneath a leaning yew tree. She remained motionless for nearly an hour before vanishing silently into the trees. Holmes said nothing for some time. Then, as the first stars emerged, he turned to me. "There is no madness in her gait," he said softly, "nor grief. Whatever she is doing deliberately." "And the song?" Holmes closed his eyes. "A ritual, perhaps. A message meant for ears other than ours." I shivered. "You mean the dead?" He opened his eyes. "No, Watson, I mean the living, those who think they've buried something and are now waiting to see if it rises." Chapter 2. A Voice at Dawnat. Precisely 5:15 the next morning, Holmes and I left the warmth of our lodgings and made our way down the winding path that led to St. Jude's Cemetery. The air was still and thick with mist, a blanket of pale grey that wrapped the iron fences, the stones, and the trees in a ghostly veil. The birds had not yet begun to stir, and even our footsteps seemed muffled, as though the earth itself was reluctant to rouse. Holmes walked ahead, his coat buttoned tightly, his gaze scanning the terrain with an exacting calm. We passed rows of leaning gravestones, many crusted with moss, and others so time-worn their names were little more than vague indentations. "There," Holmes whispered, raising a hand. A solitary figure stood ahead. Eleanor Hargreave, unmistakable, in her long black shawl, her posture regal yet impossibly still. She stood before a modest mausoleum, its stone facade chipped and worn, with the name Hargreave etched just above a pair of sealed iron doors. The ground at her feet was bare, the grass around the grave trampled in a wide semicircle, as if the place had received more traffic than a cemetery ought. We crouched low behind an overgrown laurel bush, some 15 paces away. Holmes produced a small notebook and pencil from his coat. His breath rose in slow plumes as we waited, the silence around us broken only by the ticking of my pocket watch and the distant creak of wood in the trees. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly at first, she began to sing. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before. It carried no tune that I could place, and yet it had rhythm, words that rose and fell like waves on a foreign shore. The language, if it was one, was guttural and fluid all at once. It gave the impression of ancient scripture sung backwards, a dirge half-remembered from another world. Holmes scribbled furiously in his notebook, but I found myself too transfixed to move. Mrs. Hargreaves' voice, though distant, possessed a clarity that defied the fog. It was not mournful, as one might expect from a grieving widow. It was deliberate, controlled, and chillingly precise. I glanced at Holmes, who had stopped writing, and was instead watching her face with unwavering intensity. As the final syllable left her lips, she bowed her head and touched her right hand to the mausoleum door. Then she turned and walked away. We remained hidden until she disappeared down the slope toward the far entrance of the cemetery. Holmes stood, brushing dew from his knees. She's not praying, Watson. She's communicating. With whom? I asked. Surely not with the dead. He turned to me. No, with someone or something alive and nearby. Later that morning, we paid another visit to Mr. Fenwick's office, this time with a clearer sense of urgency. "Tell me," Holmes said, placing his notebook on the solicitor's desk, "what do you know of the mausoleum? Who commissioned it?" Fenwick folded his hands. "Albert did, about 5 years ago. He paid a local stoneworker in advance, said he wanted a family vault ready in case of sudden illness." "Unusual," I said. "He was a young man, wasn't he?" 43, Fenwick replied, though his father died of apoplexy at 45, so perhaps it was in his mind. Holmes tapped the notebook. "Do you know if anyone else is interred there?" "No one. Mr. Hargreave was the first, the only." "Then we'd like to see it," Holmes said. Fenwick blinked. "The vault?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, this morning." Back at the cemetery, we met with the groundskeeper, a lean, taciturn man named Griggs, who carried a ring of keys that jangled with every step. "It's sealed, sir," he told Holmes, motioning toward the rust-flecked doors. "I was given instructions by Mr. Hargreave himself not to open it for anyone, not even the widow." "But she visits every morning," I said. Griggs nodded. "Yes, sir, but she's never asked to go inside." Holmes stepped forward and ran his gloved hand along the outer edge of the door. "There are fingerprints here," he murmured. "Fresh. From a gloved hand, judging by the smudging." Griggs stiffened. "You saying someone's been inside?" "I'm saying someone may have tried." Griggs hesitated, then offered the key. With a practised motion, Holmes slid it into the lock and turned it. The doors groaned as they opened, inward, releasing a faint gust of stale metallic air. We stepped inside. The chamber was small, just large enough to hold a single sarcophagus of polished black stone, atop which lay a simple bronze nameplate. Albert Hargreave, 1851 and 1894. The air was cold and dry. Dust had settled over the interior, but not evenly. There were 2 distinct footprints leading up to the sarcophagus, smaller than a man's boot, but too wide for a child. A woman's shoe, perhaps. Holmes knelt and examined the space between the wall and the tomb. He reached beneath it and produced a small object, a folded scrap of parchment, ancient and brittle. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes unfolded it carefully, then read aloud. "The name must be spoken where no echo dwells. The words bind the mouth that listens." He held it up to the light. "This is a cipher, a ritual phrase, possibly a mnemonic, but what it encodes we've yet to discover." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "You think Mrs. Hargreave left it?" Holmes stood. "No, I think someone left it for her." As we exited the mausoleum, Holmes turned to Griggs. "Has anyone else been in this cemetery after dark?" The groundskeeper hesitated. "Well, there's a man. Comes once or twice a week, never speaks, wears a black hat, watches her from a distance. Did you report it?" I told the constable. He laughed, said I was imagining ghosts. Holmes exchanged a look with me. "We must meet this man." Griggs gave a slow nod. "He usually comes the night after," she sings. Holmes turned toward the path. "Then tonight, Watson, we keep vigil." Chapter 3. The man in the black hat night fell over Hampstead with an eerie stillness. A brittle moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light through leafless branches that moved without wind. Holmes and I arrived at the cemetery just after 10 o'clock, guided once again by Griggs, who handed us a lantern and a flask of strong tea before retreating into the gatehouse. "I'd wager he'll come between midnight and 1, the groundskeeper had said. "That's his habit, never strays from it." We took up our positions behind a thicket of juniper near the Hargreave mausoleum, where the stones cast long shadows that danced like figures across the grass. The air was sharp, but Holmes seemed invigorated. He crouched low, scanning the rows of graves with the precision of a predator, one hand resting on his walking stick, the other on his knee. I leaned close and whispered, "You think he's watching her, or waiting for something?" Holmes didn't look away from the tombstones. Not watching, listening. This is not about the woman, it is about the song. The precise hour, the setting, the repetition. These are the marks of ritual. Someone else has a stake in her performance. We sat in silence for nearly an hour. Then, just as the constable's bell tolled midnight from the village, a shadow detached itself from the tree line to the north. A tall figure in a long black coat and wide-brimmed hat moved soundlessly along the gravel path. He paused just beyond the reach of the moonlight, then turned to face the mausoleum. Holmes tapped my arm lightly, and we both sank lower behind the bush. The man did not approach the grave. He simply stood there, motionless. And then he lifted something to his face, a small brass object glinting faintly in the light. A monocular, perhaps, or a recording device. He held it steady for a full minute before lowering it and removing a small notepad from his pocket. Holmes rose suddenly. "Stay here," he murmured, then stepped out into the clearing. The man turned at the sound, unstartled. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was smooth, articulate, neither local nor distinctly foreign, English but polished, as though scrubbed clean of dialect. Holmes did not break stride. "You have the advantage of me, sir." The man smiled faintly. "I imagine that will not last long." I joined them quickly, and Holmes wasted no time. "You've been watching Eleanor Hargreave. You've recorded her singing." "Why?" The man tucked the notepad into his coat. "Because what she sings is not hers. It is borrowed, stolen even." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "From whom?" The man glanced, back toward the mausoleum. "From an order long buried. The language she sings is called Viat Kra. It has no script. It survives only in oral fragments passed between generations under strict secrecy." "And how do you know it?" Holmes asked. The man gave a half bow. "I am its last custodian. My name is Aurelian Cray." Holmes was silent for a beat. I stepped in. "Then you should speak with Mrs. Hargreave directly." Cray shook his head. "She would not remember me, nor the source. That is the nature of the transference." Holmes folded his arms. "Transference?" Cray looked at us both with faint amusement. "You believe she mourns, that she sings from grief, but that voice is not hers, nor is the memory of it. She received it." Holmes tilted his head. "How?" Cray hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Albert Hargreave did not die of natural causes. His heart did not fail. He was emptied." My breath caught. "Emptied?" "Of will, of memory. It is a consequence of misusing the chant. When spoken improperly, it does not summon. It consumes. The person becomes a conduit. For memory. For something older than thought." Holmes regarded him with clinical coolness. "That sounds remarkably like superstition." Cray smiled, unoffended. "So it does, but allow me to offer something more empirical." He reached into his coat and produced a sheet of translucent parchment. Drawn across it in red ink was a series of circles and jagged lines, symbols that bore no resemblance to any alphabet of recognized. They looked more like echoes rendered in ink. "This," Cray said, "is the phonetic mapping of the chant, a recording etched by a device of my own design. It matches perfectly with Eleanor's song, despite her having no exposure to it and no linguistic training of any kind." Holmes took the sheet and studied it in the lantern's glow. "This line here," Cray said, pointing to a waveform-like stroke, "marks the end of the second verse. The same passage caused Albert's collapse." Holmes said nothing, but I could see the calculations unfolding behind his eyes. "Why now?" he asked. "Why has this surfaced after so many years?" Cray's expression darkened. "Because the chant is incomplete. It has two voices, one to speak and one to answer." Holmes looked up sharply. "And someone is preparing to answer?" Cray nodded. "I don't know who, but I know this. Eleanor is not the instigator. She is the key." He gestured toward the grave. "She was meant to carry the chant, nothing more, a delivery system. But something changed. She's altering it, shaping it, giving it new rhythm." Holmes handed the sheet back. "A mutation." "Yes," Holmes straightened. "You said this chant could consume. What happens if both voices are sung?" Cray met his gaze. "Then thought becomes echo, memory becomes instruction, and whoever listens too closely forgets they were ever listening." We stood in silence. Cray pocketed the sheet and turned to leave. "I will continue to listen from a distance," he said. "But you are nearer. To her now. You must be the one to ask. Who taught her to sing?" And with that, he vanished into the trees. We returned to the inn just past 2. Holmes said little on the walk back. But once inside, he began pacing furiously, his brow furrowed in that particular way that signalled some critical connection was nearly formed. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever heard of a man who transmits knowledge but forgets it himself, not outside of certain fables?" "Well," Holmes said, reaching for his coat, "we may be living one." "Where are you going?" "To speak with Dr. Miles Penrose, the man who signed Albert Hargreaves' death certificate. I suspect he may have forgotten something important." Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. Dr. Miles Penrose lived in a modest Georgian house on the edge of Parliament Hill, a short distance from the Heath. When Holmes and I arrived just after dawn, a faint wisp of chimney smoke rose from the red-tiled roof, and the lamplight inside flickered against frosted windows. Holmes knocked briskly. Within moments the door opened to reveal a tall man in his late 50s, silver-haired and clear-eyed, though his expression carried the habitual tension of one who works too often with grief. "Dr. Penrose," Holmes said, extending a gloved hand. "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We come regarding the death of Albert Hargreave." Penrose blinked, but he did not recoil. "You've come late, or perhaps too early." He stepped aside. "Come in. I've just brewed coffee." The interior was tastefully spare. No clutter, no ornament. The house of a man who believed in order, yet did not overindulge in comfort. He led us into a sitting room where the fire was already crackling. A tray with cups, cream, and toast sat atop a walnut table. Holmes wasted no time. "You signed the certificate of Mr. Hargreaves' death. Cardiac arrest." Penrose nodded. "Yes, I did." "May I ask, what made you certain?" Penrose stirred, his coffee slowly. "He had a history of angina. I treated him twice in the year before his death. Stress, irregular heartbeat. He was a proud man. Wouldn't rest, refused to retire. I found him in his study, collapsed over his desk." Holmes tilted his head. "Was there anything unusual about the scene?" Penrose hesitated. "In truth, yes. There was a stillness. The kind one feels in a church after a funeral. The kind that settles on a room where words have been spoken that can't be taken back." Holmes said nothing. Penrose continued. His eyes were open, but not glassy. They were searching, as though trying to remember something, just as it slipped away. "Did you hear anything?" Holmes asked. "Smell? Anything?" The doctor looked up sharply. "A scent, yes, sharp, like ozone, and something metallic." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "You were close to the family?" I asked. Penrose sipped his coffee. "I delivered Albert's godson, Miles Altham, a dear friend in youth. But we'd drifted. I hadn't seen Eleanor in nearly 3 years." Holmes leaned forward. "Did Eleanor strike you as prone to strange behaviour?" Penrose considered this. "No. She was reserved, intelligent, but not unusual." Holmes produced the phonetic transcription of the chant and laid it on the table. "Have you heard her sing?" Penrose's hands twitched ever so slightly. He looked at the paper without touching it. "Yes," he said quietly. "The night before the funeral. I arrived to comfort her. She asked me to sit with her by the fire. Then, without prompting, she began to hum. And, Holmes prompted, it was wrong. It chilled the room. My ears burned. And when she finished, I found that I could not recall the song itself, only how it made me feel." Holmes gave a slow nod. "You've been altered, Doctor." Penrose frowned. "Altered?" Holmes stood. "By design or by accident, she placed you within the radius of something you were not meant to interpret. You are not alone." As we took our leave, Holmes turned at the door. "One last thing. Who else had regular access to Albert Hargreave in the weeks before his death?" Penrose thought for a long moment. "There was a nurse, Miss Lydia Royston. Quiet, competent, but withdrawn. She left the household 2 days after the funeral. No forwarding address." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Did she attend to Eleanor?" "No, only Albert. We found Lydia Royston not in London, but in a boarding house in nearby Highgate. Her name was listed on the tenant register under a false surname, Randall, but a brief inquiry with the landlady revealed her true identity. When we knocked on her door, she answered in a simple wool dress, her dark hair tied in a modest bun. Her eyes, though intelligent, held a haunted gleam. Miss Royston," Holmes said gently, "we mean you no harm, but your role in the Hargreave household is of interest to us. She didn't invite us in. Instead, she stepped out into the corridor and closed the door softly behind her. I knew this day would come, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I warned him not to let her read the pages. Holmes's expression tightened. What pages? Lydia looked at me. He kept a journal. Albert. He'd taken it from a monastery library in Prague. He believed it was part of a lost doctrine, something older than the church. He translated it obsessively, but he never spoke of it. And Eleanor read it. I asked. She found it after he collapsed, Lydia said. I saw her holding it hours later. But it wasn't panic on her face. It was focus, as though something in the words had seized her. Where is the journal now? Holmes asked. Lydia's face darkened. Burned, or so she claimed. But the way she sang, it was in her. She didn't need the book any more. Holmes drew closer. Miss Royston, did she ever speak while asleep? Lydia blinked. Yes, often. She muttered in her dreams. Foreign words, rhythmic, like lullabies sung underwater. Holmes's gaze darkened. Then the chant is fully embedded. The question now is, who else has she sung to? By late afternoon, we had returned to the inn. Holmes paced the floor of our sitting room while I jotted down notes from the day's interviews. We were to have 4 clear points of contamination, he said aloud. Penrose, Royston, the constable who heard the chant, Cray, by proximity, and perhaps even Fenwick, depending on how much time he spent with her before her isolation. I frowned. But none of them have suffered the same decline as Albert Hargreave. No, Holmes replied, because they all heard fragments, partial exposures. But if Eleanor completes the chant, publicly, audibly, intact, then the full transmission could occur. I stood. Then we must stop her. Holmes looked toward the cemetery through the window. Yes, he said, but to do so, we must know who taught her to complete it. He turned back to me, his expression unreadable. And to know that, Watson, we must hear her sing again, entirely. Chapter 5. The First Suspect. The Red Herring. The sky was still ink black when Holmes and I made our way back to St. Jude's the following morning. We walked without speaking, the only sound our boots on the frost-bitten path. Somewhere behind the tree line, a crow stirred, cawing once before falling silent again. The mausoleum loomed in the mist, its sharp silhouette barely distinguishable from the marble tombs that surrounded it. Holmes had packed a compact phonograph, recently modified with a new wax cylinder, and we now crouched beneath the yew branches, where we'd first observed Eleanor Hargreaves' strange dawn ritual. "I will not intervene," he said quietly, "unless she attempts to conclude the chant. I believe the song exists in cycles, Watson, verses repeated in succession, building towards something greater. If she deviates, if she completes the cycle, we must act." "And if she's being controlled?" I asked. Holmes gave me a sharp glance. "Then we'll need to determine who holds the leash." The air shifted. Eleanor emerged from the tree line a few minutes before 5, draped in her mourning shawl, her movements slow but unhesitant. She walked the path with the grace of one who no longer notices her surroundings. Holmes wound the phonograph behind the juniper bush and waited. She reached the mausoleum, placed one hand gently on the iron door, and began to sing. The sound was no less chilling the second time. But now Holmes held a small slate and began transcribing the syllables phonetically in real time. R's softened, "Nasals unusual," he muttered. Some Slavic bass, but interwoven with proto-Tyrannic roots. No known grammar. I felt a headache forming from the sheer repetition of the unnatural cadence. The third verse began to change, subtly, fewer pauses, a crescendo not present before. "She's completing it," I whispered. "No," Holmes said abruptly. "She's distorting it." Her voice wavered as she reached a final, elongated syllable. It echoed once in the silence, and then vanished like breath into stone. She did not bow this time. She stood still, eyes closed. Then she turned and froze. Holmes and I stepped out from the brush. "Mrs. Hargreave," Holmes said gently, "we must speak." Her eyes, startlingly blue against her pale face, did not widen in surprise, looked between us with eerie calm, then gestured toward the mausoleum. It was his song, not mine. "You sang it of your own will?" Holmes asked. "No," she said. "Not at first. I dreamed it. Then I remembered it." "You read it, didn't you?" Holmes asked. "From Albert's journal?" She hesitated. "He said it would be safer if I didn't. But curiosity," she trailed off. "I read it once. I never needed to again." Holmes stepped closer. "Who taught you to complete it?" Eleanor looked past him. "Someone is listening, even now." "Who?" She turned away. "Ask Fenwick." Holmes said nothing on the walk back. At precisely 7:30, we arrived once more at the solicitor's office, where Percival Fenwick greeted us with a mixture of confusion and restrained politeness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, to what do I owe this surprise?" Holmes stepped forward, removing his gloves. "You visited Mrs. Hargreave multiple times after her husband's death, did you not?" "Twice. She invited me." "Why? And during these visits," Holmes continued, "did she speak to you of the journal, or show you anything unusual?" Fenwick hesitated. I believe she mentioned reading something, but I was more concerned with her well-being." Holmes's tone sharpened. "Did she sing to you?" Fenwick's brow furrowed. "Certainly not." "Are you sure?" "Yes." Holmes studied him carefully, then took a step forward. "Your handwriting is distinct, Mr. Fenwick. Left slanted, looped capitals. It appears in Eleanor's appointment book, marking the date of your second visit. It also appears on a note we discovered hidden behind a ledger in your office." Holmes produced the folded slip, retrieved during a brief, unscheduled moment earlier that morning. Fenwick took it, frowned, and paled. "I don't remember writing this." "You did," Holmes said. "It contains the same glyphs, disguised as legal shorthand, that Eleanor sings aloud. You transcribed them. You passed them along." Fenwick stepped back. "That's impossible." "Not if you were influenced," Holmes said. "You spent time with her after she had read the journal. If she spoke even part of the chant near you, your subconscious might have recorded it, like a whisper stuck in the corners of memory." "But I don't remember." Holmes nodded. "Because you were never meant to. You were meant to transmit, not retain. Just like Lydia. Just like Penrose," I interjected. "Then he's not guilty." "Guilt implies intent," Holmes replied. "Fenwick was a vessel, but not the source." Fenwick collapsed into his chair. "I thought she was grieving. I thought I was helping." Holmes turned to him. "You were, in the way a tuning fork helps an instrument. Now, Mr. Fenwick, I must ask, do you keep records of all your correspondence?" "Yes, everything." "Then we'll need to review the letters addressed to Albert in the months before his death, especially those sent from abroad." Fenwick looked puzzled. "I suppose I can gather them. But why?" Holmes met his gaze. "Because someone sent him the chant in the first place, and that person may be closer than you think." An hour later, in the solicitor's back filing room, Holmes rifled through a leather-bound stack of letters from the prior year. I assisted where I could, but his mind was moving far faster than mine. Then he paused. "This one," he said, holding up a cream-coloured envelope bearing a Prague postmark. It was addressed in delicate copperplate, but with no return name. Inside was a short message on vellum parchment. "Albert, as agreed, the fragments are enclosed. Read them with care. The chorus must only be spoken in silence, and only by a voice unclaimed. Do not share them with your wife. They are not safe." "See, I asked. Holmes looked grim. "Cray." "But Cray warned us," I said. "He's been watching her." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, watching. But perhaps not merely as a guardian. Perhaps as a shepherd." As we stepped back onto the street, Holmes folded the letter and placed it into his pocket. He sent Albert the chant. He knew its risks, yet he claims to be the last custodian. The question is no longer what Eleanor is singing, but what Cray is waiting to hear. "And if he's lying," I asked, "then we're already late." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue, a Hidden Inconsistency. Returned to the inn as noon bells rang distantly across the village. Holmes remained silent for much of the walk, his brow furrowed, his fingers twitching at the edges of his coat sleeves. Always a sign of intense inner calculation. I did not press him with questions. I had seen him like this before, treading the thin line between intuition and revelation. It was best to wait until the lightning struck. Back in our modest sitting room, Holmes placed the Prague letter on the table between us and stared at it as if willing it to speak more plainly. "Cray is a contradiction," he said at last. I sat forward. "You mean he's lying?" "No," Holmes replied. "That would be too simple. He's concealed something, yes, but his fear is real. His urgency, genuine. His concern for the chance transmission appears sincere." "Then why send the fragments to Albert Hargreave?" Holmes tapped the table. "Because he believed Albert was immune." I frowned. "Immune?" "Cray said the chant must only be spoken by a voice unclaimed." Holmes said, "Whatever that means, he must have believed Hargreave met the requirement. But Albert read it, translated it, and something went wrong." "Then he miscalculated," I said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Or someone interfered?" He stood and walked to the window, peering down at the cemetery beyond the trees. "We've been focused on Eleanor as a passive carrier, one who inherited the chant through grief or accident. But what if that's the illusion?" "You think she's aware of what she's doing?" "I think she's more than aware," Holmes replied, "and someone has helped her become that way." He turned from the window and began pacing. "We have one known intermediary, Lydia Royston. She handled Albert's care during the final weeks, and she witnessed Eleanor reading the journal. She claims to have fled in fear." "She didn't seem deceptive," I said. "No," Holmes said slowly, "but she was too well informed. She knew about the Prague journal. She understood the danger of the chant. She even suspected that Eleanor had absorbed it. But there's something she didn't say, something that caught my attention." He opened his notebook and turned to a page near the back. "On the day she left the Hargreave household, she did not return directly to London," he said. "I reviewed the inn's guest book. She spent one night at a private house in Bloomsbury, owned by a publishing firm." I blinked. "A publisher?" Holmes nodded. "Brock and Etcheverry, an obscure printer of limited-run theological and esoteric texts. Their client list includes some of the most eccentric scholars in Europe. I suspect she attempted to sell a copy of the journal's contents before disappearing into Highgate. That doesn't align with fear." "No, but it aligns with desperation. Perhaps she wanted to disarm the journal by exposing it. Or perhaps—" He trailed off. I picked up the Prague letter again. What about the phrase "voice unclaimed"? Cray was insistent about that. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Yes, that is the inconsistency. He reached into his satchel and retrieved the phonograph cylinder we had recorded during Eleanor's last chant. The concept of a voice unclaimed implies a person unbound by previous iteration, a vessel of linguistic innocence. But Eleanor was married. She lived a cultivated life. She is not unclaimed in any conventional sense. He placed the cylinder in the playback device, adjusted the stylus, and lowered the needle. The hum of the chant filled the room once more, soft at first, then building. Holmes pointed to the phonetic transcription on the slate beside him. "Now, Listen to this passage, 3rd verse, 2nd phrase." We waited, and then it came. The syllables shifted, barely. A pattern emerged that was distinct from the earlier chant, shorter staccato consonants, a rising intonation at odds with the previous cadence. "She changed it," I said. "She altered the chant." Holmes nodded. "More than that. She personalized it. It no longer fits the pattern Cray described. It is no longer unclaimed." I leaned back. "So, if the voice is claimed, what happens?" Holmes turned toward the fire, his expression dark. "Then the chant may no longer be bound by its original limits. It becomes creative, which means Eleanor Hargreave is not the victim of a transmission. She's the author? No, she's the editor." There was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Griggs, the cemetery groundskeeper, looking anxious. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I thought you ought to know. There was someone at the cemetery last night. Again." "Not Cray?" Griggs shook his head. "No, sir. Someone shorter. Wore a veil. Couldn't see the face. They went up to the mausoleum after Eleanor left. I followed. They stayed inside for nearly 10 minutes. Holmes's eyes narrowed. The door was unlocked? Griggs hesitated. No, they had a key. 10 minutes later, we stood once again before the iron doors of the mausoleum. "Same footprints as before," Holmes said, crouching. "But see here, another print, narrower, high heel, recently made." He ran his hand along the stone near the base of the tomb. "And here, scrape marks. Someone slid something out from beneath." He reached in and pulled out a second piece of parchment, this one crisp and unweathered. He unfolded it. There, written in the same angular glyphs as before, was a new sequence, slightly different, sharper, and beneath it in faint English, a line in Eleanor's handwriting. "She returns when memory ends." Holmes studied it, then handed it to me. This is not just a chant, it's a summoning, not of a spirit, but of a linguistic state, one in which memory collapses and only rhythm remains. I stared at the parchment. Like hypnosis. More invasive, like overwriting. Holmes turned and looked out across the cemetery. "We must find Cray again," he said. "He claimed to be the last custodian, but I suspect there is another, and I fear it is Eleanor herself." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The morning passed under a muted, colourless sky that pressed low against the rooftops of Hampstead. Holmes had taken to pacing again, across the narrow dimensions of our sitting room, from hearth to window and back, as though walking might accelerate the turn of thoughts, already racing at unbearable speed. "I have reviewed the chant," he said suddenly. 6 times. Each rendering Eleanor gives is slightly different. No true repetition. That alone violates Cray's claim that the chant is fixed. "Then the chant is evolving?" I asked. "No, Watson," Holmes said, halting. "It's alive." That word hung in the air longer than it should have. Not metaphorical, not dramatic. Clinical. Holmes turned. "We are accustomed to treating language as a tool, but this is different. Eleanor is not wielding it. It is using her, just as it did Albert, just as it nearly did Fenwick. A contagion of syntax, disguised as mourning." Before I could respond, a knock interrupted us. This time it was not the landlady or Griggs, but a courier in a green uniform, bearing a folded note sealed with wax. Holmes took it, sliced it open, and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I fear I have misled you. I am not the last custodian. There is one more. Meet me tonight, just before dusk. St. Barnabas Chapel, crypt entrance. Come alone. Bring no phonograph, no paper, only memory. A. Cray. He stared at the page, frowning. He's either desperate, Holmes said slowly, or nearing the truth. The remainder of the afternoon passed uneasily. Holmes refused all food and sat in a stiff-backed chair with his fingertips pressed together, eyes closed. Occasionally, he would mutter a word under his breath. Syntax, structure, carrier. Before falling silent again, just before 5, we departed. St. Barnabas Chapel sat just outside Hampstead proper, wedged between a grove of willows and the outer wall of a long-defunct asylum. The church had been deconsecrated decades ago, its stained glass shattered, its steeple cracked, the iron bell still hanging like a forgotten warning. The crypt entrance, accessible through a rusted gate, led to a series of vaults beneath the nave. We arrived just as the sun began to bleed into the horizon. Cray was already waiting, half-shadowed near the open gate. He wore no hat this time, and his eyes were strained, as though he had not slept. "I thank you for coming," he said softly. "It may be the last thing I ever ask." Holmes gestured. "Who is the final custodian?" Cray turned, leading us into the darkened corridor. "Not who, what?" The air grew colder as we descended, lantern flickering against mould-streaked walls. Bones of past parishioners lay in sealed alcoves, their names lost to time. At the very back, behind a rusted gate, Cray stopped and turned. "The chant is not a song," he said. "It is a memory system, designed by an ancient sect not to preserve knowledge, but to encode experience. Their belief was that memory could be separated from the mind, stored in sound and passed on. A kind of immortality, but incomplete." "Incomplete?" Holmes asked. Cray nodded. "The chant preserves memory, but destroys the self. It converts living thought into language, then spreads it. And now it is complete, because Eleanor made it so." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin notebook. "I lied," he said. "There was one more copy, not the journal, not the fragments I sent Albert. This, the original field notes from my time in the Carpathians. It details what the chant is truly for." Holmes opened the notebook and scanned the page. His face paled, not with fear, but with recognition. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes looked at Cray. "You didn't just send Hargreave a chant, you sent him a map." Cray closed his eyes. "I thought he would only read it, that he would lock it away. Instead, he taught it to his wife." I stepped forward. "Then he is responsible." "No," Holmes said quietly. "He was a victim. Eleanor wanted the chant. She wasn't corrupted by it. She sought it out." Cray gripped the rusted bars. "Then she's the one who completes the circle." Holmes lowered the notebook. "She's not singing to the dead," he said. "She's preparing the living." We returned to the inn just before dark. A letter awaited us. This time it bore no seal. Only 2 words scrawled across the page. "Tomorrow. Dusk, and beneath it, a location, West Hill Asylum." Holmes read it twice. Then he said, "We must speak with her tonight." The gates of the Hargreave estate were locked, but Holmes had anticipated this. We crossed the grounds under cover of dark, through the orchard path Eleanor used in her daily walks. The house stood tall and lifeless, no lights showing from the upper windows, but someone was inside. Through the conservatory, we caught sight of a flickering lantern. Eleanor sat at a table, surrounded by books and fragments of parchment, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She was writing, feverishly. Holmes raised a hand. "Wait." We watched in silence as she stood, walked to a cabinet, and removed something long and narrow, a tuning fork. She struck it against the edge of the desk. The note rang out, clear and low, and she hummed in response. Holmes's voice was barely audible. "She's tuning herself." I felt a cold trickle slide down my spine. Then Eleanor stopped. She turned, and for the first time, her eyes met mine. They were not surprised. They were waiting. She stepped forward and opened the French doors to the terrace. "You've come," she said, as if welcoming old friends. Holmes remained composed. "To ask you one thing, Mrs. Hargreave." "Yes?" He stepped closer. "Why now?" She smiled, softly, almost sadly. "Because only now does it remember me back." Before we could speak again, she lifted the parchment from her desk and began to sing. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The first few seconds after Eleanor began to sing, the air in the room itself seemed to hesitate. The note she struck, resonating from the tuning fork, hung in the space like a thread pulled taut across silence. And her voice followed, gliding into the same key with unnatural precision. Holmes stepped forward, as if moving through fog, his posture rigid, but his eyes watchful, not on her lips, but on her hands. They did not tremble. They moved deliberately, tracing symbols in the air with each measure. This was no ritual of grief. It was a performance. "Watson," Holmes murmured without looking back, "close your ears. Not with your hands, with your mind. Focus on anything else." I did my best. I recited fragments of Latin verse, counted backwards from 100, tried to remember my surgical rotations in India. Still, the song pressed in, like an invisible pressure against the eardrums. Less sound and more sensation. Then Eleanor stopped. The silence that followed was not merely absence. It was void, like a door had closed not in the house, but somewhere behind thought itself. "I didn't come to be stopped," she said evenly, looking directly at Holmes. "I came to complete the work." Holmes did not flinch. "And what, precisely, does that completion entail?" "An echo," she said, "one so perfect it replaces the voice that created it. The chant was never about summoning. It was about transference." "To whom?" I asked, my voice dry. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Anyone who listens closely enough." Holmes stepped closer, his tone clipped and precise. "You've been altering the chant, Mrs. Hargreave. I've transcribed at least 3 variations across 4 performances. Why? Because perfection is static," she said. "It ends. I needed it to evolve, to live. Albert couldn't do that. He preserved. I shaped." "You're not singing to awaken something," Holmes said quietly. "You're singing to create it." She said nothing. Holmes removed a folded scrap from his coat, the one Cray had given him from his notebook. "This original version, this memory chant, it requires 2 voices, one to speak, one to answer." Eleanor looked down at the page. I rewrote the answer." "Why?" She looked up at him, and for the first time her composure cracked, just slightly. "Because the original was death. The echo was empty, but I heard something else." Holmes said nothing. "After Albert died, I dreamt of a place," she said softly. "A structure, stone rooms, no doors, but the walls remembered. I knew in the dream that if I sang the chant within those walls, something would sing back." "You've been teaching the chant," Holmes said, "piece by piece, to others, unwittingly." "Memory is not theft," she said. "It is drift. What touches one mind brushes the next. I have only helped it find form." Holmes's tone grew sharper. "And what happens when it finds too many minds?" Eleanor turned toward the desk. "Then perhaps it lives beyond the speaker." She moved to pick up the parchment, but Holmes was faster. He seized it, folded it quickly, and slipped it into his coat. "You've created a carrier wave," he said. "A psychic mechanism for imprinting linguistic code into the listener's short-term recall. That's why those who've heard you can't remember the chant, but feel its influence. You think I don't understand what I've done," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "I chose this. After Albert died, all that remained was grief and forgetting. But this is permanence. A song that remembers me, even when the world forgets." Holmes's voice lowered. "That's not memory. That's infection." She paused, just for a heartbeat, then smiled. "Even infections can give birth to new life." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we leave, now." I followed him, wordlessly. Eleanor made no move to stop us. Only as we reached the front door did she say, "It's already begun." We walked briskly through the orchard. The night air was colder than before, and my thoughts were spinning. "You believe her?" I asked. Holmes kept his pace. "I believe she believes herself, which is more dangerous." He stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Watson, when someone begins speaking in an unfamiliar language, what's the first thing you notice?" I blinked. "The sounds, the structure." "Exactly," he said. "But what if the structure is familiar and the words are not? Your brain fights to match it, fills in the gaps. You think the chant exploits that?" "I'm certain of it," he said. "It's not designed to be understood. It's designed to be completed by the listener. The meaning is constructed inside the mind of the receiver." We resumed walking. "Tonight proved something," Holmes said. "She's no longer a conduit. She's become an origin. That final performance, it was not repetition. It was improvisation. And yet, it retained the shape." "The shape?" I asked. "The emotional cadence, the rise and fall. Like an old melody embedded into new lyrics. She is singing something ancient, but she's rewriting it instinctively. That is the key." "And Cray?" Holmes was silent for a moment. I think he hoped to contain it, or perhaps delay its progression. But he underestimated the one thing no custodian can control: interpretation. As we approached the inn, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Griggs. His face was pale. His cap was in his hand. "You'd better come quick," he said, breathless. "It's the chapel. St. Barnabas. Someone broke in, left something inside." We followed him at once. The chapel was still, the doors ajar. Inside, on the altar where no prayer had been spoken for decades, lay a thick manuscript. bound in red cloth, edges charred, its cover marked with a single glyph. Holmes approached it carefully. He opened it. Inside, the text was handwritten in Chius, a looping scrawl, pages upon pages of transcribed chant sequences, diagrams, annotations, interspersed with what appeared to be dreams. And on the first page, in black ink, a title the answered voice Holmes turned to me. She's published it. Chapter 9. A Second Attempt. The culprit strikes again. The chapel smelled of mildew and parchment and something harder to name, like static, or the first seconds of a lightning storm. Holmes stood over the altar, his gloved hands carefully turning the fragile pages of the answered voice. I watched the flicker of lamplight dance over the glyphs, each one jagged, curling, unfinished, as if the writer had captured a living thing in ink and bound it to a page. She's trying to replicate the chant, Holmes murmured. Not preserve it, expand it. Griggs hovered by the chapel doors, cap twisting in his fingers. I found it like this. No one saw who came in, but the lock was smashed from the inside. Holmes closed the book. We'll take this with us. It's no longer a chant. It's a template, a blueprint for something new. We returned to the inn under a velvet black sky, the stars lost behind thick clouds. Holmes secured the manuscript in a lockbox and tucked the key into his coat. Only once it was safely hidden did he allow himself to sit by the fire, his gaze distant. She knows she's being watched, he said quietly. She's accelerating the process, spreading the fragments, letting the chant mutate. The book was never the goal. It was bait. Bait for what? I asked. For resonance, he said. A perfect iteration. Someone else will finish what she started, and I believe I know who. He stood abruptly. Get your coat, Watson. We're going to speak with Fenwick. Percival Fenwick was not at home. His house was dark, the curtains drawn, the iron gate ajar. We found the front door unlocked. Never. A good sign, Holmes muttered. Inside, the rooms were silent. A single lamp burned low in the study, where a glass of half-drunk sherry sat beside a copy of the Times. Nothing was overturned. Nothing was missing. But someone had been here. Holmes moved swiftly, scanning the floor for prints. No sign of struggle. He left willingly. He turned to the desk. A single sheet of paper lay face down. Holmes read it aloud. I heard it again. In my dreams this time. She was not singing to me. She was singing as me. I must understand it. I must finish the final verse. I go to her. P. Fenwick. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. He's going to the estate. Holmes was already moving. No, he's going somewhere more private, somewhere she sang before, somewhere she taught. We paused, and both said it at once. The cemetery. We reached St. Jude's by lantern light, our boots sliding over damp stone. Mist clung to the air, graves like shrouds. At the far edge of the cemetery, the Hargreave mausoleum loomed black and expectant. The iron doors stood wide open. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of candle wax and something older, like paper gone to rot. Fenwick knelt by the sarcophagus, his eyes wide, glassy, fixed on something beyond sight. He was humming, low, rhythmic. unnervingly close to Eleanor's chant. Holmes moved fast, crossing the marble floor in 2 strides and seizing Fenwick by the shoulders. "Stop!" he barked. "You don't know what you're saying." Fenwick blinked. She showed me in the dream. The words came back, but they weren't hers. They were mine. I remembered them. Holmes shook him once, not unkindly. "They are not your memories. They are fragments, implanted by proximity, by repetition. You've been caught in her net. She said I was the mirror," Fenwick whispered. Holmes turned to me. "Help him up. We're taking him out of here." But before we could move, a second voice echoed from the mausoleum doorway. "Leave him." Eleanor stood in the threshold. Tishier's shawl was gone. She wore a white coat, high-collared, hands folded at her waist. Her expression was calm, not angry, not afraid, serene. "He's not in danger," she said. "He's becoming." Holmes stepped between her and Fenwick. "You've rewritten the chant to be incomplete unless heard by a second voice. He's the responder." "No," she said. "He's the echo." I felt a chill slide through the crypt. Holmes's voice hardened. "You can't complete it alone. You need him to recite it. But you've altered the pattern so severely. There's no way to tell what effect it will have." "That's the point," Eleanor said. "We are conditioned to fear uncertainty. But language evolves when it is misunderstood. The misread scripture, the mistranslated letter, that is when it begins to live." Holmes stepped forward. "You have no idea what this chant will do." Her smile deepened. "Don't I?" And then she began to hum. It was not loud, but Fenwick responded at once. He rose to his feet and began to sing, not with understanding, but with the practiced rhythm of one who had heard the melody 100 times in dreams. Their voices twined, hers high, his low, rising, coiling, sinking. Holmes moved. He pulled a small silver mirror from his coat and held it between them. The effect was immediate. The harmony faltered. Eleanor recoiled, clutching her temple. Fenwick staggered, his voice breaking off mid-phrase. "What is that?" I asked, helping Fenwick to sit. "A counter-reflector," Holmes said. "Cray built it. It scatters recursive harmonic input. It breaks the loop." Eleanor knelt, gasping. Holmes stepped forward, voice gentler now. "You were right about one thing. Language does evolve through error, but not through collapse. The chant is not knowledge, it is burden. The more minds carry it, the more it shatters." She looked up at him, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Just wanted to be remembered." Holmes knelt beside her. "Then tell the truth." She said nothing more. Later, as dawn broke, we returned to the inn with the manuscript, the mirror, and Fenwick in tow, silent but lucid once more. Holmes placed the manuscript in the hearth and lit a match. As the first flames caught the edges of the answered voice, he said, "It isn't what we understand that harms us. It's what we finish before we understand it." And the chant, unfinished, burned quietly into ash. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The following morning was one of those rare moments in Hampstead where the fog seemed to lift not only from the streets, but from the mind itself. A pale light crept across the window-sill of our lodging, illuminating the curled edges of Holmes's notes and the faint scorch marks left in the hearth. where the answered voice had turned to ash. Holmes sat at the writing desk, unmoving, his gaze fixed not on any page, but on the space just beyond it. His breakfast sat untouched. "You've barely said a word since last night," I remarked gently. He didn't look at me. "That's because, Watson, I'm listening." "To what?" He tapped a finger against his temple. "Residual cadence. I heard the chant in its nearly completed form. Not as a listener, but as an observer. And even that proximity lingers." He finally turned. "I need to know what it wanted. Not what Eleanor claimed it was. Not what de Cray feared. But the true purpose of the chant's existence. You think it has one? I think it has only that. Everything else, memory, grief, identity, was camouflage. The chant was never about preservation or mourning. It was about contact." "Contact with what?" Holmes stood. "That is what we must determine. And I believe the answer lies not with Eleanor, but with Cray." Aurelian Cray was not at the inn, nor at the cemetery, nor at any of the usual haunts where Holmes's informants could place him. It was as though he had vanished into the fog, just as Eleanor had predicted. But Holmes was not content to chase phantoms. He sent 3 telegrams and then waited, sifting through his notebook like a gambler reshuffling a broken deck. At noon, a response arrived. It was from an antiquarian in Prague, a former Jesuit turned rare book dealer named Gregor Malik, whom Holmes had consulted years before on the subject of medieval ciphers. "Your man Cray visited last year, requested a copy of Vox Iterata, an apocryphal translation of pre-Byzantine chant fragments. He paid in silver, took notes, returned 1 month later, and asked for a second book, Codex of the Hollow Concord. That one he never returned." Holmes lowered the note. "Watson, we've been looking at this wrong. Cray was not the end of a line. He was the conduit between 2 systems of knowledge, one ancient and fragmented, the other modern and structured. He didn't invent the chant. He crossbred it." "You mean he created a hybrid?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And Eleanor, whether he intended it or not, was his proof of concept. Her mind completed what his could not." "And what would that create?" I asked. "A memory virus? A belief system?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Worse. A self-aware phrase. A sequence of sound designed to rewrite the mind that hears it, like code rewriting itself in the machine." He began to pace again. "And now we must ask the question neither Cray nor Eleanor dared to confront. What happens if the chant is heard by someone with no resistance at all? No filter, no skepticism, only reception." I felt a chill move through me. "You think someone else has already heard it?" "I'm certain of it. We returned to the Hargreave estate that evening. Eleanor was under quiet house arrest, no constables, but watched discreetly by 2 members of Lestrade's division. Holmes had requested discretion from Scotland Yard. No mention of rituals, chants, or anything that might encourage public hysteria. We found Eleanor in the conservatory, seated by the window, dressed simply, her shawl folded neatly in her lap. She looked older than she had just 2 nights ago, or perhaps merely emptied. Holmes sat opposite her. "You knew," he said, "from the beginning, that Albert's journal was not benign." She nodded. "I knew, but not what it would do. Then what did you want? She looked out the window for a long time. To be more than a memory. To leave something behind that was felt, not just read. Holmes's tone was gentle now. You created more than sensation. You created replication. I stopped, she said. I stopped before it completed. Holmes leaned forward, but someone else didn't. Who did you share the full chant with? She flinched. No one. Holmes's voice hardened. Eleanor. She swallowed. There was a girl from the chapel, a novice. I sang to her once, only a verse. I didn't think. Holmes stood. A perfect echo needs only one listener who doesn't know they are listening. I frowned. Who is she? Her name is Clara, Eleanor whispered. She left the chapel 2 days ago. Where did she go? Eleanor's voice was barely audible. She said she was going to West Hill. Holmes's entire posture stiffened. Then we're out of time. West Hill Asylum sat on a windswept hill just outside the edge of Hampstead, an ageing structure of red brick and black iron that had once been a hospital for melancholics. Now it housed those whose minds had cracked not from loss, but from things too large, too strange, or too precise to contain. We arrived just before dusk. The orderly at the front desk barely glanced up. Visiting hours are closed. Holmes flashed his credentials from the Home Office, an old favour from Mycroft. We're here for a patient. Clara Rowe, recently admitted. The orderly paused. She's not listed under patients. Holmes's voice dropped. Then check staff. He did, and found her name. 3rd floor, East Wing, music therapy assistant. Holmes nodded. We'll find her. We took the stairs 2 at a time, our boots echoing down the tiled corridors. The 3rd floor was dimly lit, each door marked with a brass number, some cracked open to reveal patients staring silently at the walls. And then, just as we reached the end of the corridor, we heard it, a voice. Faint, singing, not Eleanor's, younger, higher, but identical in cadence. Holmes burst through the final door. Inside, Clara Rowe stood beside an old Victrola, eyes closed, singing softly to the 4 patients seated in front of her, each of them swaying slightly, their faces blank. Holmes crossed the room in seconds and struck the stylus from the record. The singing stopped. The silence was thunderous. Clara opened her eyes and stared at Holmes, not in fear, but in recognition. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes's Grand Strategy. Holmes stood frozen, his fingers still hovering above the shattered stylus. The silence in the room was so total, I could hear the clock ticking 3 doors down the corridor. The 4 patients, their postures slack, continued to sway gently even after the music had stopped. Eyes unfocused, lips parted slightly, as if waiting for a word they would never speak. Clara Rowe looked at Holmes as though she had known him all her life. "You came," she said softly. Her voice was light, clear, and too calm for the circumstances. She was no older than 20, with neat dark hair tucked under her nurse's cap and a touch of colour in her cheeks. But behind her eyes was something that didn't belong to her, a sense of memory too vast for one mind. "I had to," Holmes replied, regaining composure. "You've been singing for them." "I was shown how," Clara said. "By Eleanor." Clara nodded, only a little at first. In the chapel she sang to the night. I heard it from the kitchen, thought it was prayer, but it stayed with me long after. I began to dream it. Then I started finishing it. Did she give you the words? No, just the shape of them. Holmes turned to examine the record on the Victrola. It was plain, unmarked. Not a phonograph cylinder like Eleanor used, but a flat disc, mass-producible, anonymous. You recorded it? I asked. I didn't need to, Clara said. The chant writes itself if you remember it clearly enough. Holmes shot me a glance. Mnemonic encoding, self-replicating. I only played it once for them, Clara added, nodding at the patients. They liked it. Did they understand it? Holmes asked. No, she said, but it made them quiet, peaceful. Holmes stepped between her and the patients. Clara, what you're singing is not music. It's a cognitive sequence, a linguistic virus. It was never meant for comfort. I disagree, she said softly. It's the only thing they heard. Everything else fades, but this stays. I knelt beside one of the patients, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and trembling hands. I took his wrist. His pulse was steady. I held his gaze, but he did not blink. He's responsive, I said, but not present. He's listening, Clara said. Still. Holmes's voice dropped, and if someone answers his echo. Clara tilted her head. Then the chant becomes truth. Holmes suddenly turned towards the door. We must leave now. I blinked. What is it? Holmes turned to Clara. How many records did you make? She hesitated. 2. 1 for them. And the second? I gave it to a visitor. Holmes's face tightened. Who? I don't know his name, but he said he was from the archive. Holmes turned to me. That's not an archive. That's distribution. 10 minutes later, we were flying down the steps of West Hill, the wind whipping past us as Holmes barked orders to the attendant at the desk. No one leaves. Lock the patient wing. Notify Inspector Lestrade. Immediate quarantine. The attendant stammered. Quarantine for what? Holmes didn't answer. He stormed into the street, motioning for a hansom. Where are we going? I asked, climbing in beside him. To London, Holmes said grimly. Someone is preparing to broadcast the chant. The second record is out there, Watson, and if it reaches the right ears, it will finish what Eleanor began. The cab lurched forward. Holmes gripped the edge of the bench, eyes narrowed. We need to get ahead of it, and for that, we must make the next move our own. Back at 221B Baker Street, Holmes moved with the intensity of a man mid-game. He rummaged through files, ripped open drawers, scribbled notes, and summoned half the British Telegraph Office with a flurry of urgent missives. One he addressed directly to Mycroft. Need full surveillance on commercial record distributors operating out of West End and Southwark. Look for recent orders matching unnamed discs or anonymous consignments. Suspect audio content tied to non-verbal induction sequences. Highest urgency. Another he sent to Lestrade. Secure St. Jude's. Retrieve all remnants from Hargreave Mausoleum. No exceptions. Quarantine staff. Cross-reference known visitors to West Hill. 1 week back. Forward names immediately. Within an hour, responses began to arrive. One stood out. A clerk at Cornwell Distribution, a mid-sized record press in Southwark, reported a recent order for 24 unmarked gramophone records. delivered to an abandoned theatre hall near Fleet Street. The address was known to the constabulary, used years ago as a radical print shop, before being shut for non-compliance. Holmes's eyes lit with something dangerous. That's the echo chamber. We arrived at the theatre just after nightfall. It was a blackened brick building with a weather-worn marquee and shattered stained glass along its side windows. The front doors were chained shut, but Holmes bypassed them with a pick and torch. Inside, the air was thick with dust and sound, not audible at first, but felt. Holmes stopped just inside the main hall. "They've begun." Faint, barely there hums seemed to move through the walls, like vibrations waiting for form. At the far end of the room stood a raised stage, and atop it a table of equipment. Gramophones, amplifiers, stacks of records, and a man standing over them. Holmes strode forward. "Cray," he said. Aurelian Cray turned, but it wasn't the same man. His face was hollowed, his eyes rimmed in dark circles. He looked not like a scholar, but like someone who had heard too much. "You found her," he said, voice cracked. "Clara?" Holmes advanced. "You were always the second voice. Eleanor was only the beginning." Cray smiled faintly. "She gave the chant body. I gave it purpose." "What's your purpose, Cray?" Holmes demanded. "Rebirth through language, memory without mind?" Cray gestured to the equipment. "Echoes, Mr. Holmes. The world is noise. The chant orders it. And when it consumes those who hear it, then they become part of it." Holmes stepped closer. "But you made a mistake," he said. "You left the answer unfinished." Cray faltered. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the silver mirror. "You forgot about reflection." He thrust it toward the gramophone. The resonance wavered. Just enough. Cray clutched his head, gasping. "I can still complete it," he choked. Holmes shook his head. "No," he said. "You already did." He raised the mirror high and shattered it against the gramophone. The chant stopped. Dead, Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The silence that followed the shattering of the mirror was unlike any I had experienced before. It was not simply an absence of sound. It was a vacuum, as though even the memory of noise had been erased from the air. Cray fell to his knees on the stage, clutching his temples, the remains of the silver-backed mirror glittering at his feet like frozen lightning. Holmes stood over him, unmoved, his expression carved from stone. "You were trying to finish it," Holmes said, "but you never understood that a chant which completes itself must ultimately destroy its speaker. Not because of malice, but because of closure." Cray coughed once and looked up. "You still think it's about language?" "It's always about language," Holmes replied coldly. "But not the words, the gap between them, the silence that demands to be filled." I stepped forward cautiously. "Is he dangerous still?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, because he believes." Cray chuckled. A hollow, brittle sound. "You think you stopped it? You think shattering that mirror ended the chant?" "I know it interrupted the sequence," Holmes replied. "Disrupted the resonance. The sound wave never reached its harmonic convergence." "But the meaning did," Cray said, eyes wild. "She taught it to the girl. I only gave it form. But the moment they harmonized, the shape was made. It doesn't need sound anymore." Holmes went very still. "Explain," he said. Cray licked his lips. "You're still thinking like a detective, looking for the murder weapon. But this isn't a weapon. It's a symmetry, a shape in the mind. Once you perceive it, truly perceive it, you can't unsee it. It repeats. You repeat. That's the point." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You're describing a self-propagating cognitive structure." "Exactly," Cray whispered. "An idea that uses memory to reproduce, not through sound or print, but through pattern, through retelling, through the minds that carry it." I felt my blood run cold. "You mean the chant can spread, even if no one hears it?" Cray nodded. "It spreads through meaning, through understanding. It's in her. It's in the girl. It's in anyone who's seen enough to guess what it might be." Holmes stared at the broken gramophone, then at the scattered records. Then he turned to me. His face was pale. "Stricken, Watson," he said quietly. "Write nothing of this. Nothing at all. Not a word. Not even in your private journal." I began. "Not one syllable," he said, stepping forward, gripping my arm. "Because if what he says is true, then the chant is no longer a song. It is a conceptual contagion. It can no longer be sung, only understood. That makes it vastly more dangerous." Cray sat back, smiling weakly. "Now you see it." Holmes turned to him. "But you didn't. Not really. If you had, you'd never have tried to finish it, because the moment it completes, the mind fractures." Cray's smile faltered. Holmes stepped down from the stage and motioned for me to follow. "We leave him. Lestrade will collect what's left." "But what if he tries again?" I asked. "He won't," Holmes said, "because now he knows, and no one who knows dares to continue." Outside, the night had turned thick with drizzle. London seemed distant from that crumbling theatre, as though the world itself had shrunk to the size of the echo chamber. Holmes walked in silence for several streets before speaking again. "It was never about voices," he said at last. "It was about attention. The chant required not just to be heard, but understood imperfectly. Half seen, half believed. That's where it took root." "And what of Eleanor?" I asked. "She tried to end it," Holmes said. "But by then it had grown beyond her. The moment she altered it, shaped it, it ceased to be hers." I nodded slowly. "Like a story retold, exactly. And with every retelling, more is lost, until only the shape remains." We reached Baker Street just as the lamplighters finished their work. The gas flames flickered softly in the fog, casting long shadows over the pavement. Back inside, Holmes locked the remnants of the records, the Prague letter, and Cray's original chant diagrams into a thick iron strongbox. He double-locked it, then placed the key into a hollowed-out book on his shelf labelled Botany, a study of alpine mosses. A volume, I suspected, no one but Holmes would willingly open. Then he sat down in his chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and stared into the fire. I made tea, brought it to him, and sat opposite. For several minutes we said nothing. Then Holmes broke the silence. "Watson," he said, "do you recall what Eleanor said the first time she saw us? She said, 'You've come.' Yes, not why we'd come, not who we were, just that we had arrived, as if she had expected us all along. You think she was already affected? No, he said. I think she was already gone. Said nothing. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain began again. Holmes closed his eyes. And now, he said softly, we are the only ones who remember what she sang. I shivered, not from cold, and we sat there, two men alone in a room filled with unspoken echoes, each carrying the weight of something that no longer had a name. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. It was late in the evening when the knock came. Not sharp, not urgent, just steady, like the drip of water on stone. Holmes and I had remained at Baker Street through the day, speaking little. He had taken to the violin, not playing it, but tuning it, again and again, adjusting strings a hair's breadth, only to retune them once more. I had never seen him more on edge, not even during the Moriarty affair. But this was not tension born of confrontation. It was born of dread. When the knock came again, Holmes rose slowly, walked to the door, and opened it. Standing on the threshold was Inspector Lestrade, his face unusually grim, his coat soaked through. Holmes didn't wait for a greeting. Who? Clara Rowe, Lestrade said. She's gone. My stomach dropped. Gone? Holmes asked. Vanished from West Hill an hour ago, Lestrade said, stepping in. No struggle, no forced entry, just gone. The attendants assumed she was still on rotation. She left a note. He handed it to Holmes. It was brief, scrawled in pencil on a torn scrap of paper. He said the final voice must come from silence. I will sing only once more. Where it began. I felt my throat tighten. She's going back to the cemetery. Holmes was already pulling on his coat. No, he said. She's going where it truly began. The chapel. St. Barnabas Chapel lay dark and undisturbed, its rusted gates still ajar from our previous visit. But as we stepped inside, Holmes paused. The air was wrong, not cold, not warm, just full, as though the very atmosphere were thick with unspoken phrases. The nave was empty, the altar bare, but the crypt entrance glowed. A dim orange light flickered beneath the door at the rear. She's in the vault, Holmes said, and she's already begun. We descended the stone steps quickly. The light grew brighter with every turn. Somewhere below, a voice was rising, not loud, but sustained, pure, unwavering. We emerged into the chamber below. Clara Rose stood in the centre of the crypt, barefoot, arms outstretched, her eyes closed. Around her were rows of unlit candles, and at her feet, open on the floor, was a new book. Not Eleanor's, not Cray's, hers, and she was singing. Not in Eleanor's tone, not in the fragmentary cadence of the original chant, but in a form that was unmistakably her own. Holmes stepped forward, voice sharp. Clara? She didn't flinch. Clara, listen to me. This is not your voice. It's not your thought. You're being used. She opened her eyes and smiled. No, she said, I am the voice now. She sang louder. Holmes moved quickly, stepping over the threshold into the candle ring. Instantly, the pitch of her voice shifted. A harmonic emerged. A lower vibration, felt more than heard. The stone beneath my feet began to tremble. She's using echo structure, Holmes shouted over the sound. It's spatial now. The chamber amplifies it. I drew my revolver, pure instinct, but Holmes raised his hand. No bullets! Sound will carry through the discharge. He turned to Clara. You've completed the sequence. But do you know what you've written? She blinked slowly. The answer? Holmes took a step closer. Then what was the question? Clara faltered. The pitch wavered. She looked confused. The sound dimmed fractionally. Holmes pressed on. You said you would sing once more. You believed it would finish something. But did you ever stop to ask what happens when it ends? Clara's brow furrowed. It continues. No, Holmes said almost gently. It repeats, and repetition is not life. It is death. For a moment she stood still. Then she looked at the book at her feet, and she screamed, not in horror, not in pain, but in fury. The chant collapsed. The sound imploded. Candles extinguished themselves. The light died. We stood in sudden deafening silence. Clara fell to her knees. Holmes rushed forward, scooped up the book, and shut it without reading. A single page. He wrapped it in his coat and stepped back. She was sobbing now. No longer the echo, just the girl. It's gone, she whispered. I felt it. Leave. Holmes crouched beside her. That wasn't you. It was something wearing your voice, something shaped by the unfinished thoughts of others. She looked up at him. Then what am I? Holmes paused. You, he said, are what remains when the chant ends. We emerged from the chapel into a crisp wind that smelled of rain and damp stone. Lestrade was waiting near the gate with 2 constables. Clara was taken quietly, without resistance, into protective care, not as a suspect, but as a survivor. Holmes said little on the way home. Only once, as we passed a bookseller's closed shop window, did he stop and look at the volumes on display. Watson, he said suddenly, do you recall the Fisher King myth? I nodded. A wounded king in a ruined land, his healing tied to a question never asked. Holmes gazed at the reflection in the darkened glass. We spend so much time answering things, he said. We forget the danger of asking the wrong question. I said nothing, but I thought of Eleanor, of Cray, of Clara, standing barefoot among echoes, and of the one question none of them had dared to ask. What listens when we speak without meaning? Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The case, in the traditional sense, was closed. The records had been destroyed. The manuscripts sealed. Clara Rowe was under the care of specialists from the Royal Asylum in Greenwich, where no music or chant was permitted within its wards. Eleanor Hargreave had retreated into near-total silence, speaking only in simple sentences, refusing to utter a single note. And Aurelian Cray, the architect of the sequence, remained confined in Scotland Yard's deepest archives, his mind flickering between lucidity and fragments of half-remembered syllables. Yet Holmes had not rested. For the better part of 3 days after the collapse of Clara's chant, he remained a ghost in his own rooms, emerging only to pace the floorboards of Baker Street at odd hours, or to scribble diagrams on the backs of discarded newspapers. Something is still missing, he said on the 3rd evening. We've seen the echo and its architects, but we haven't seen the spark, the first shape. You believe there was something before Eleanor? I asked. Holmes nodded. The chant as we encountered it was already altered. By Eleanor, by Cray, by Clara. But what Albert Hargreave read, that was the original form. And if he didn't invent it, he must have discovered it, which means he trailed off, rifling through the pile of recovered correspondence from Fenwick's office. He paused at a folded envelope bearing the now familiar Prague postmark. He opened it again, read it, then frowned. "This letter was not from Cray," he said suddenly. I leaned forward. "You're sure?" He held up the signature block, pointing. Cray signed his letters with a simple "C." This one ends with "in truth, A." "Albert," I guessed. "Unlikely," Holmes said. "Albert received this letter. He didn't send it." He turned to the reverse of the envelope. A faint watermark. Bibliotheca Acustica, Praha. "The Library of Acoustic Studies," Holmes muttered. "The place where the chant's origin may truly reside." By midday the following day, Holmes had coordinated with Mycroft and secured a contact at the Czech consulate. We would not be travelling to Prague. But the library would send a facsimile of the requested material by telegraph and diplomatic pouch. It arrived at 221B 2 days later, a brittle onion skin packet of tightly typed translations from a manuscript, known only as Telos Vera. The name, according to the accompanying note, translated roughly to "the voice that ends." Holmes laid the packet flat and read through it in full silence. He finished, then read it again. Only then did he speak. "It's not a chant," he said. "Not in the musical sense." I frowned. "But we've heard it sung." Holmes nodded, because that is how it survived. But it began as something else, a legal vow. He tapped the translated text. This fragment is an oath spoken aloud in the lost dialect of an ascetic order predating the 4th century. Its purpose was not to invoke a deity, but to erase identity. To speak the vow was to relinquish memory, to unbind the self from time. "That sounds like suicide," I said. "Not quite," Holmes replied. "The speaker did not die, but they became undefined. The chant rewrote their mental architecture. What remained was a vessel, a structure without story." And that's what Eleanor read. "No," Holmes said, "that's what Albert read. And when he read it, it began rewriting him. Not all at once, not even consciously. But as he translated, it translated him. And when he died, Eleanor, curious, bereaved, picked up the pieces. And completed it? Not completed. Adapted." He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. She gave it context. She imbued the chant with emotion. Her mourning, her love, her confusion, all of it flowed into the structure. It changed the nature of the vow, from relinquishment to invitation. A call not to dissolve, but to resonate. "A ritual," I said softly. Holmes nodded, but the form remained. The original syllables, the cadence. Even stripped of belief, the structure still functions. That's why Cray and Clara responded to it. Because the code was always embedded in its rhythm. He gestured to the last page of the translation. There's a phrase at the end. "He who remembers not the words, but the pattern, carries the voice." I sat back slowly. "So even we may carry a fragment of it," Holmes said. "If not consciously, then subliminally. A cadence, a whisper, a rhythm in our sleep." I glanced at the fireplace. What do we do with the translation?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then, "We bury it." I raised an eyebrow. "Not destroy?" "No," he said, "because destruction gives it weight, fear, a sense of forbidden knowledge. That's what feeds it. It must be placed somewhere so boring, so unread, that its very existence is forgotten. Like the moss book." "Exactly." He stood, took the manuscript, and slipped it into an envelope. Then he crossed to his bookshelf and removed botany, a study of alpine mosses, pulled back the false lining, and tucked the papers beside the key to the strongbox. Then he closed it and said no more. That night, Holmes did not play the violin. He sat by the window, watching the rain gather in rivulets across the glass. I sat by the fire with a book I did not read. The silence in the room was not tense, but it was deep. "Watson," Holmes said quietly at last. "Yes. When you write this case, fictionalize it." I looked at him. Change the names, the places, muddle the sequence, blur the truth. Because it's dangerous? Because if someone reads the real pattern, even wrongly, they might get close enough to finish it. I nodded slowly, and Holmes added just above a whisper, "Let it die in fiction, where all dangerous truths belong." Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was late April when Holmes received the final letter. A pale, wax-sealed envelope left without fanfare on the windowsill at 221B Baker Street. No postmark, no courier. Only a single name inscribed in delicate handwriting on the front. Sherlock Holmes. He did not open it immediately. He stared at it for several minutes, as though it might detonate upon touch. Then, with quiet precision, he broke the seal and unfolded the parchment inside. There was no message, no signature, only one line, printed in block capitals. I remember the chant, beneath it a second line, so faint I had to lean close to read it, and now it remembers me. Holmes said nothing for a long time. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Call Lestrade," he said. The final gathering took place 3 nights later in the upper drawing-room of the Royal Academy of Linguistic Forensics, a forgotten institute with no students, no lectures, and one stubborn old professor who owed Mycroft Holmes a favour. The guests arrived at dusk under strict instructions from Holmes. Come alone, bring no papers, and speak only when addressed. Inspector Lestrade was the first to arrive, followed by Dr. Miles Penrose, drawn and pale but lucid. Then came Lydia Royston, summoned from Highgate under protective escort. Aurelian Cray was delivered in silence, flanked by 2 attendants from Scotland Yard's high-security ward. Clara Rowe, the final arrival, was ushered in under a blanket and watched by 2 discreet nurses. Holmes stood at the head of the long table, his usual cool detachment now wrapped in an air of grave intent. "You are not here as witnesses," he said. "You are here as links, each of you touched, however briefly, by the chant. You've heard it, dreamed it, transcribed it. Some of you tried to end it. Others tried to understand it. Tonight, you will all forget it." Murmurs of confusion swept the room. Holmes raised a hand. The chant, regardless of origin, is no longer a language. It is a construct, self-replicating, viral. It lives not in books, not on discs, but in the spaces between memory and meaning. And like all such constructs, it cannot be killed. He stepped forward and placed a small object in the centre of the table. It was the silver counter-reflector, the second one, hand-forged in secret and untested until now. This, Holmes said, is designed to disrupt recursive harmonic imprinting. In short, it scrambles the echo of the chant that may still exist inside your minds. Lestrade leaned forward. You think we're infected? Not in the medical sense, Holmes said, but in the structural one. A cadence may remain, a dream, a hum. You may find yourself saying things without understanding why. This device cannot erase what you remember, but it can reframe it, reduce it to meaningless syllables. And if it fails? Royston asked softly. Holmes's voice was steady. Then we isolate you, indefinitely. Silence fell, and then Cray laughed, not wildly, not cruelly, just softly, like someone who had seen the ending already. It won't work, he said. You can't undo meaning. Once the pattern forms, it's you. The chant isn't remembered. It remembers you. Holmes regarded him coolly. That remains to be tested. He activated the device. A low tone, inaudible to all but the subconscious, filled the room. One by one, the others sat back. Eyes glazed, not from hypnosis, but from dissonance. Their internal rhythm, however faint, was being disrupted. Cray hissed and slumped in his chair, clutching his head. Clara blinked rapidly. It's quieter. Royston pressed a hand to her temple, like something went out of tune. Penrose was weeping quietly, though whether in relief or confusion I could not tell. Holmes waited until the tone faded. Then he said simply, "It's done." Later, as we walked back through the silent London streets, Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "I do not expect it to last," he said, "but I expect it to delay." "For how long?" He looked up at the stars. "Long enough. Do you think they'll forget?" "No," he said, "but they will no longer pass it on. And that is enough." We crossed under a flickering gas lamp. Holmes paused, staring at the sidewalk as though he saw something written in the cracks. "I've never truly feared information, Watson," he said. "But this was not knowledge. It was shape masquerading as meaning. A loop pretending to be a story." He looked at me, eyes suddenly tired. "Promise me you'll never write this down." "I already have," I said quietly. "But I changed the names." He nodded once. "Then bury it where no one will care to read." We continued walking. Behind us the city exhaled, oblivious, and somewhere, in some quiet corridor of thought, I could almost hear it, a rhythm, faint, but finally fading. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. We had not spoken much in the days following the final gathering. Holmes was, as ever, restless when a case concluded, not from elation, but from the dull ache of completion. There was no victory in this particular ending, only containment. And even that, as he often reminded me, was temporary at best. But on the fourth morning after the harmonic interruption, he broke the silence. "Come, Watson," he said, rousing me far earlier than was civil. "It's time we laid the bones of this matter out plainly, before the fragments become folklore." We returned to the drawing-room at the Royal Academy. now vacant and stripped of its spectral air. Holmes had requested chalkboards and brought with him a small leather case filled with notes, letters, fragments of phonetic transcriptions, and the faded remnants of Eleanor's earliest scribbles, copied, not carried, from the edge of madness. For the next 2 hours, he reconstructed the full timeline with his usual unrelenting clarity. It began, he said, not with Eleanor Hargreave, nor even with Albert, but with the letter sent from Prague, unsigned, ambiguous, and misattributed. Whoever sent that letter, possibly a monk, a linguist, or a collector of forbidden phonetics, provided Albert with a fragment of what we now know to be Tellus Vera, the so-called voice that ends. He tapped the blackboard, where the words "the voice that ends" had been written in bold white chalk. Albert, ever the intellectual adventurer, believed he had stumbled upon a linguistic curiosity, but what he had found was a living sequence, an unfinished auditory oath designed to obliterate memory and identity. He began transcribing it, refining it, and perhaps without realizing, internalizing it, I interjected. You believe the act of transcription was enough to affect him? Holmes nodded. He need not have spoken it aloud. The chant works not through performance, but through pattern. Once Albert had engaged with the chant's syntax, its rhythm, its intention, it began to rewrite his cognitive framework. He suffered heart failure, yes, but I believe it was a systemic collapse, neurological in origin, a breakdown between language, selfhood, and biological function. He paced. After his death, Eleanor finds his notes. She does not recognize them for what they are. She believes them to be remnants of her husband's unfinished work. But in reading them, in mourning through them, she alters the chant. She folds emotion into its structure, adds cadence, inflection, sorrow. He stopped at the second chalkboard, which bore 3 lines. Original chant. Recursive Eleanor's chant. Emotional variant Clara's. Version. Harmonized construct. This is the crucial shift, Holmes said. Eleanor's grief gives the chant a purpose beyond dissolution. It becomes not a vow of forgetting, but a song of remembrance. But this shift makes it worse, not better, because what was once inert becomes seductive, infectious. A melody the mind clings to. I nodded. And Clara? Clara is the perfect storm, Holmes said. A blank slate, young, musically trained, emotionally porous. She hears Eleanor's chant once and absorbs not the words, but the framework. Then she dreams, and in dreaming she completes it. He turned back toward the center of the room. That's what makes Clara so dangerous. Her chant was not inherited. It was authored. A new iteration with the old pattern embedded. And unlike Eleanor, who sang from sorrow, Clara sang from instinct. Her version is the most potent, and the most permanent. And Cray? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Cray saw the chant as a relic, a sacred ruin. He believed it could be preserved, even worshipped. But he never understood that the chant was not a monument. It was a seed, one that grows in whoever hears it. He lifted a final sheet from the case. It was Clara's transcription, taken from the record recovered in the Fleet Street Theatre. You see these glyphs? Holmes pointed. They're not just symbolic. They form a temporal loop, a melody that rises and resets, building tension without resolution. It is structurally designed to never conclude. That's how it multiplies. I stared at the notations, trying to grasp their meaning. Holmes tapped the page again. Eleanor began the cycle with memory. Cray attempted to preserve it with reverence. Clara gave it life with harmony. But the final transmission, the truly dangerous form, was ours. You and I, Watson, who observed it, chronicled it, followed its every step. I went still. You're saying we've helped it? Holmes's voice dropped. Yes, and that's why this story, when you write it, must mislead. No rhythm, no correct phrasing, alter the syllables, break the shape. Ensure that no reader, however curious, can reconstruct the chant by inference. I swallowed. What if they try? Holmes met my gaze. Then they will find only silence. Because the chant, in its true form, is no longer a thing that lives. It is a thing that listens. And now we no longer speak to it. He placed the final piece of chalk down. We speak around it. We left the academy that afternoon and walked slowly back to Baker Street. Holmes seemed lighter, not with relief, but with resolve. There's a danger, Watson, he said at last, in believing that knowledge must always be acquired. Some doors, once opened, do not close. Yet you opened it, I said. You followed it through. Yes, he admitted, because someone had to. But someone also had to shut it again. And for once, I believe we have. He turned to me as we reached the steps of 221B. Now, my friend, let us speak no more of singing widows, dreaming girls, or vanished oaths. We will lock the door and walk away. He smiled faintly. Until the next whisper, of course. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. It is a strange thing in the life of a man who investigates the crimes of others, to find himself contending not with malice or motive, but with resonance, with the ghost of a sound that, if recalled too precisely, might reorder the mind. In the weeks following the close of the case, Holmes and I returned to the familiar rhythms of our lives at Baker Street. The papers, mercifully, made no mention of the events. To them, Clara Rowe had suffered a nervous collapse. Eleanor Hargreave had withdrawn from public view, and the matter of the Hargreave estate had been placed into quiet legal arbitration. Not a single line of print spoke of chants, or oaths, or cognitive echoes. This, Holmes assured me, was by design. The truest form of justice in this case, he said one morning over a cold cup of tea, was severance. The chant was a parasite. The only way to ensure it doesn't return is to sever it from attention. No names, no story, only silence. And Clara? I asked. She is in recovery, he replied. Her mind was not broken, only bent. I received a letter from Dr. Llewellyn at the Greenwich Asylum. She no longer dreams the chant, no longer sings in her sleep. He believes with time she may even forget it completely. She was a victim, I said. Holmes nodded. As was Eleanor, as was Cray. Even Albert, in his quiet pursuit of knowledge, was drawn into something no man was ever meant to understand. What of Cray? I asked. Will the Yard prosecute? Holmes leaned back. There is no crime to charge, no law against transmitting an idea. He will remain confined, yes, but not for guilt, for precaution. He remembers too clearly, and those memories, however dormant, might still resonate. I fell quiet. then asked after a pause, "And what of us?" Holmes looked at me with something close to melancholy. "We carry the shape, Watson, not the chant itself, but the outline of it, like a footprint long after the traveller has passed. As long as we don't retrace those steps, we're safe. But if someone else finds those tracks," he tapped his fingers once against the table, "then they'll have to decipher them alone." That night I sat by the fireplace, pen in hand, unsure if I should write anything at all. Holmes had asked me not to document this case, but he had also trusted me to distort it, enough to bury the structure, but not the truth. And so I began my notes, under a false title, with altered names and a shifting timeline. I called it The Case of the Echoing Grief, and I framed it as a psychological puzzle, a study in collective hallucination and mass delusion. But I left clues: a librarian in Prague, a widow who sang in forgotten tongues, a chapel where meaning collapsed under sound, and a detective who saw the danger of curiosity not when it asked, "What is this?" but when it whispered, "What if it never stops?" In the final days of April, Holmes and I received one last visitor, Lestrade. He arrived with his usual stiffness, but this time there was something gentler in his eyes. "I came to say thank you," he said, "though I couldn't tell you for what." "You don't need to," Holmes replied. Lestrade handed him an envelope. "This is from Penrose. Said you should read it when you were ready." Holmes took it and waited until Lestrade had gone, before opening it. Inside was a short letter, written in careful, steady script. Mr. Holmes, I no longer remember the chant, nor do I recall the structure. I only remember the silence that followed it. That, I believe, is your doing. Whatever you did in that room, thank you. I shall spend the rest of my days forgetting with joy." MP Holmes folded the letter and placed it in the fire without reading it aloud. "Good," he said simply. On the last morning of the month, as the lilacs returned to Regent's Park, and the world settled back into its spring rhythms, Holmes and I took a walk. He said little. But as we passed a group of children playing beside the pond, one of them began to hum. A strange loping tune, not melodic, not quite familiar. I saw Holmes stiffen for the briefest moment. Then he exhaled. "No," he said, "just a song." And we continued on. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. The case that had begun with a whisper in a widow's throat ended with silence, deliberate, cultivated, and fragile. In the weeks that followed, Holmes resumed his violin, though I noticed a change in how he played. The melodies were slower now, more fragmented, as though he were trying to unwrite sound. He, too, was different. The temptation to document the affair in full remained, a chronicler's instinct not easily stilled. Yet each time I sat down to recount the truth, I found myself redacting even my own memory, as if some part of the chant lingered not in the mind, but in the form of remembering itself. I did as Holmes asked. I altered, I obscured, I erased. It was late one evening in May, the gas lamps flickering dimly through the fog, when Holmes spoke again of the case, not in analysis, but in something approaching sentiment. We had just returned from a minor theft in Chelsea, child's play compared to what had come before, and Holmes had poured himself a measure of brandy. He stood by the window, watching the street below with narrowed eyes, though his gaze was clearly turned inward. "Watson," he said, "have you ever wondered why some truths arrive not as declarations, but as melodies?" I looked up from my chair. "You mean why we feel certain things before we understand them?" "Yes," he said. "The chant was never dangerous because of its content. It was dangerous because it bypassed understanding, like music, like grief." He turned back to the window. "Eleanor was not the first to sing it, but she was the first to mean it. That changed everything." "You think she shaped the chant through intention?" "No," he said. "I think the chant shaped her through permission. The moment she gave it meaning, it gained power. That's always the way with dangerous ideas, not when they're invented, but when they're believed." I sat in silence, letting that settle. Then, "And what of Clara? She was a reflection," Holmes said, "a mirror without tarnish. She didn't seek power. She only echoed what she heard. But in doing so, she came closer than any of us to completing the chant." He refilled his glass, then paced slowly back to the fire. "It's ironic, is it not, that a detective, trained to uncover facts, should find his greatest challenge in something that defies articulation?" "Then why follow it?" I asked. "Why not let it fade?" Holmes looked at me then, truly looked. "Because the mind must pursue what unsettles it, even if that pursuit ends in silence." He gestured toward the bookshelf where the manuscript from Prague now rested, hidden, sealed, and anonymously labelled. "I've stored every clue, every page, but I shall never read them again. Because the final piece of the puzzle, Watson, was never linguistic." I leaned forward. "Then what was it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Compassion." I blinked. "Compassion? Yes. It was not logic that broke the chance cycle. It was kindness, a refusal to let grief calcify into ritual. Eleanor stopped because someone finally heard her, not the chant. Clara broke free because someone reminded her she existed. And Cray surrendered because he saw that madness, even dressed as philosophy, leads only to solitude." He sipped his brandy. "You see, Watson, in the end, it was not an incantation we defeated. It was the very human desire to give pain structure, to make mourning sacred, and in doing so, to risk never moving on." A long silence followed. Then Holmes turned away from the fire, his silhouette tall and lean in the flickering lamplight. "Lorne, others chase monsters made of numbers, or riddles forged in blood. But if ever you see someone humming to themselves, alone at a grave—" He paused. "Listen carefully. And if the song has no end, don't finish it for them." The last line of the chant was never spoken aloud. It remains, to this day, a fragment, untranslated, unclaimed, and perhaps that is the mercy in it, for not all mysteries beg to be solved. Some only wish to be left alone. And so, as the record of this affair passes into obscurity, changed beyond repair, buried within fiction, I leave only this final truth, unvarnished, that Sherlock Holmes, the great detector of facts, once saved the world not through evidence nor deduction, but by choosing to forget.